Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar and question and answer session on effective giving. My name is Natasha Avery, and I'm a program associate at the Laura Arriaga Andreessen Foundation. I manage our online education portfolio along with the Giving Circles program. This educational series is designed to help our members learn about different ideas, philosophies, and techniques in philanthropy. And for our first session, we're so lucky to have Charlie of The Life You Can Save joining us to talk about effective giving. And whether you're a new giver or a seasoned giver, I'm sure you'll be able to learn from Charlie in The Life You Can Save. I'll just provide a quick biographic overview of his career. He brings a really wide range of experiences to his role at The Life You Can Save. Charlie earned a PhD in social and clinical psychology from Clark University, and then served as the director of behavioral medicine for the California School of Professional Psychology for 7 years as a professor. After that, he forayed into the private sector, where he was recruited to the Men's Warehouse and became the head of human resources, then stores, marketing, and finally was president. But then in 2008, decided to step down from his role in order to work directly on wealth inequality and philanthropy, which brought him to The Life You Can Save. And so Charlie is going to be giving us a 20-minute overview of The Life You Can Save and how it plays into the effective altruism movement. And after his overview, we're going to open up the floor to questions, which you can ask directly through the Hangout app. Or if you'd prefer, you can email them to me directly at natasha@laaf.org. That's natasha@laaf.org. And Charlie, I'll let you take it away from here.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Natasha. And thanks everyone for joining today and taking some time out of your busy day. You all can fire questions to Natasha. I don't think I can see them, given that we've chosen to put these slides up, but she will try to relay your questions during the presentation to me. And of course, at the end, we'll have hopefully plenty of time for questions. It's a little bit challenging to do question and answer and discussion, but excuse me, we'll do the best we can. I apologize in advance for my laryngitis. I've been battling an upper respiratory infection for about 10 days, which actually feels dramatically better than it sounds. So I apologize to all of you. Natasha, I just lost the first slide. And so I guess we're showing the video now, and that's fine. So I'll be cueing Natasha, who's in control of the slides, to put the slides up. So again, please fire off any questions you want along the way. I think that my habit in giving talks, whether I was teaching graduate school or leading educational seminars for our store managers at the Men's Warehouse, or now with The Life You Can Save, is always to give people the punchline at the beginning in case they fall asleep. In this case, maybe get distracted by eating your lunch or your colleagues or who knows what. So the punchline is that most people in the United States who give money to charity probably have spent more time picking out the restaurant they were going to eat at with their friends or family the last time you had dinner out than they do thinking about where they're going to give their money and the impact that money is going to have. Now, I recognize that in this audience, we have a highly selected group of people who actually defy that and have given thought to philanthropy, and it's not the norm. But I think everyone who's tuned in here today should realize that you all are a big exception, and that most people don't give their money considering the impact it's going to have or do much research. So I want to explore how it is that people choose to give their money and what some of the effective alternatives are. So that's the essence of what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, Natasha, do you want to go to the next slide? Natasha, can you hear me? Yeah. So Natasha already highlighted my story, so I don't really think there's a lot of I need to get into, except to say that when I stepped down from the president position of the Men's Warehouse and told George Zimmer, who had recruited me and been very good to me and bringing me onto the Men's Warehouse back in the early 90s, that I didn't want to do this anymore. What I had in my mind was I wanted to start thinking about ways I could have more of a social impact in the world and be less involved in the private sector in terms of businesses that are really for profit. And so that was why I made that decision. It took a couple of years to really find my place in social impact. When I was on holiday, I read a book by the philosopher Peter Singer. I don't know how many people on the call today know Peter Singer by name or by reputation, but Peter started writing about extreme poverty and what our moral obligation is towards extreme poverty and helping people in extreme poverty back in the early 70s with a very famous essay that he published, I believe it was in the New York Times initially, called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. He also is the father of the animal rights movement and has been very concerned about the treatment of animals. Today, I won't be talking about animal rights. I'll be focusing on extreme poverty. But when I wrote Peter, I had read a number of his books, including a book called The Life You Can Save, after which he named the charity that I'm now executive director of, The Life You Can Save. And I wrote him an email and said that I wanted to help develop his organization. I noticed he had a website. It turned out that he didn't have much of an organization. And he and I and my wife all met and talked, and we decided to put in the seed money to develop the organization rather than Diana and I just writing checks to highly effective charities on the assumption that, or the hope at that time, that if we built an organization, rather than invest $1 in a really great charity, we could multiply that investment many, many, many times over. And so we've been really fortunate from 2013, when I started on this endeavor, through the present, we have already multiplied that initial seed money many times. And so we're really grateful to Peter for starting the organization and for the privilege of being able to help with it. Natasha, do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. As I said in the opening, one can ask themselves the question, how much time and energy do I put into choosing where I'm going to use my time for doing good, and also where I'm going to put my financial resources? And when we look at the macro situation across individuals in the United States who give collectively, without any reference to foundations, $240 to $250 billion a year, it's a massive amount of money that's donated. But unfortunately, it's not always, or it's frequently not donated for the right reasons. It's donated for reasons I'm highlighting on this slide. So, for example, people will reward organizations that do great marketing. There's a recent example of that where we had the Ice Bucket Challenge, where people were dunking their heads in buckets of ice, which was very dramatic and kind of compelling. And it was for the organization that supported the research on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is an absolutely horrendous disease that inflicts pain and suffering and eventually death on people all around the world. But it is a very rare disease, and it is not a major cause of death or suffering in the world by any means. But because of the great marketing, it received an inordinate amount of financial support. So that is not atypical. That is a pretty common situation that organizations that do really, really good marketing receive a lot more dollars. Another reason that people give money is because in their own circle, somebody has perhaps died of an illness or been stricken by an illness, and they want to support their family member or their friend by giving money to that illness, not the illness itself, but to the research to prevent or to limit the damage associated with the illness. Another reason people give school money is because their friends ask them to give money. For example, they may choose to give money to their friend's school for a computer lab. Even if the school is a relatively privileged school, their friend asks them, it's hard to turn down. Or maybe their friend is going to be in a breast cancer race, or they're going to be in a multiple sclerosis bike race. And it's very, very hard to turn people down. And very few people think, well, that's a really good thing to do, because who could argue with giving money to support research on breast cancer, or who could argue against using money to support research to find a cure for multiple sclerosis? But when you actually look at some of the illnesses that more people in the world are dying from or suffering from, you can see that the relative impact of those donations is not that great. Now, can I have the next slide, Natasha? Thanks. I hope you can see this chart. So this, I think, really sums up how we actually do give our money. So if you look in the lower left part where the X and Y axis meet, where it's low social impact and small circle of compassion, all of us, including myself, use a lot of our financial resources down in this lower left part. We support our children, we support ourselves to have luxuries that we deem we want or quote unquote deserve. And we spend a lot of our resources where it has low social impact and a very, very small circle of compassion. But it's very human to do that. And I'm certainly familiar with that because, like probably most people on this call, I've spent a considerable amount of my family resources and my wife's family resources over the years on this lower left corner. Then if we move up towards where the arrow in the middle points, we get to perhaps what might think of as more effective uses of money. You start to use your money to do the kinds of things I was mentioning, which is disease prevention or helping a school, etc. Perhaps a more effective use than buying a luxury automobile, which we probably don't need, or going out for a medium or expensive dinner, which we might be able to do without, or buying lattes 3 or 4 times a week when that money could be used to do something else. So as we move up, we start using our money in what might be thought of as more effective ways. But most money that is donated to charity is not used in the absolutely most effective way, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And we tend to keep our donations in a smaller circle of compassion, which means they tend to be more local, sort of fulfilling the idea that charity begins at home. If it doesn't begin at home, it at least begins in my community or in something touching my community, or at the very least in my country. And one of the things that the Life You Can Save and effective altruism is challenging as a movement is whether or not this aphorism, charity begins at home, is something that maybe we should be challenging. And of course, at the Life You Can Save, as I'm implying, we want to challenge that very notion. And we want to suggest that there are more effective ways of giving than always assuming that charity should begin close to home. So can you have the next slide, Natasha? Before I move on, since I can't read anybody's body language or see if I'm losing you all or if people really have questions, let me just pause a second before I talk a little bit about this slide, which I've already alluded to, and see if anybody wants to fire a question at Natasha, through Natasha to me. And I'm going to take 10, 15 seconds to just pause.
Hi, Charlie. So I actually have 2 questions lined up.
Okay.
We can start. The first sort of directly responds to what we were just talking about in terms of how can you measure and think about important issues that might be hard to kind of measure in the same way that like investing in vaccines might be, such as civil rights or women's rights?
That is a great question, and I'm going to get to that in a minute when I ask the question of everybody needs to think about how to do the most good. And the short answer to that question, which I hope I'll get into soon in more depth, is one can't know whether working on women's rights is more important than helping children in the developing world avoid death from diarrhea or malaria. It's really impossible to know. But I think there's real value in asking oneself the question and perhaps saying, well, women's rights are really important. And we know that empowering women, particularly in the developing world, helps develop sustainable economies that will make it easier for people to rise out of poverty. So that's a good thing to do. But then we also have to ask ourselves the question, but what about fundamental life and death issues like keeping children alive until they're 5 years old, which we know how to do, but we often don't have the resources to do. So we know, for example, that insecticide-treated bed nets used properly, as Against Malaria Foundation does, will keep children alive as well as men and women. And we know that if we give people, particularly children under 5, we give them liquids, IV liquids sometimes are necessary, when they're having severe diarrhea secondary to a number of gastrointestinal disorders, that they can recover from those illnesses, and instead of dying from dehydration, they can live. So it's very, very hard, and sometimes you have to be Solomon to weigh these things. I think what I'm urging at this point is that people ask themselves the question and consider the possibility that there's a hierarchy of needs, and that some of these fundamental needs that we have met in the developed world, like the ability to get rehydration therapy when our children have diarrhea, are primary, and that some of these fundamental rights, like civil rights, as well as women's rights, which is a form of civil rights, are incredibly important, but maybe don't take primacy over some of these fundamental needs. These are not questions that are easy to answer, and it's a good question. So maybe we'll get to that a little bit more, but why don't you ask the other question, Natasha? And if somebody has a follow-on question, we ask that question, certainly come back and challenge what I'm saying or ask another question.
Great. So the second question is asking, or is presenting a new idea. To summarize, CM is asking about the Life You Can Save's willingness to collaborate on a new consortium that embraces shifting student learning towards effective giving, global citizenship, and higher order thinking. Or how can classrooms kind of foster effective giving and these ideals of responsible global citizenship?
Well, I'm really happy that you asked, and the answer is we would love to collaborate. And so there's a person who works at the Life You Can Save, whose name is John Behar. He's our Chief Operating Officer, and he's been advocating something called Giving Games for several years. And if you go to our website, there's a lot of material on Giving Games, and I think it's a natural for collaboration in this area. So Natasha, perhaps at some point towards the end of the talk, we should give my contact information so people who want to collaborate, who want to follow up something that's been said, can get in touch with me. That might be a really good thing to do. I'm not sure the best way to do it, but the answer is we're very interested in that kind of collaboration. Great.
Those are all the questions we have right now, and we can definitely return at the end and talk about some ways to keep staying involved. Would you like to get back to the
yeah, I'll get back to the slides. So I highlighted this indirectly, but you can see from this slide that there are several barriers that stand in the way of people considering how to donate most effectively. One is a high degree of loyalty to the causes that you've been donating to. So it says at the bottom here in red on the far left that only 13% of donors intend to give to different nonprofits next year. And that's all well and good if what they're doing now is giving to a very, very effective cause and organization. And it still needs more money. But that's not so good if it's a habit, like a lot of habits, that doesn't get put back in the sort of scrutiny of the individual. And that loyalty, which sounds like a great word, actually can inhibit effective giving. If you see another kind of challenging statistic in the middle, is that only 9% of people compare organization impact. And when you think about like the amount of time you might spend on TripAdvisor if you're going on a holiday, or you might spend on Yelp if you're going to a restaurant, you'll probably, particularly if you're in a new city, spend 10 to 15 minutes comparing 2, 3, 4, or even more restaurants or bed and breakfasts or hotels. And when you think about the fact that in a year, only 9% of people compare organizations, it goes back to my statement that unfortunately, many people are spending more time thinking about the quality of where they stay or eat than they are about the impact of the organization they give money to. And then 54% of donors prefer to give to local or regional nonprofits. That's not even domestic. That's something that, as I said, is in your own community. And that supports this concept of charity begins at home. 95% of donations in the United States are given to domestic, not just local and regional, but domestic organizations, with only 5% going to international organizations. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to discuss why we should consider international giving as a preferred method of giving. And so if anything, these numbers of 95.5 that are currently the dominant way of giving come closer to what should be, if we're most effective, inverted. And I'm not suggesting that people on this call or people in the United States will want to give 95% of what they give internationally and only 5% domestically. But if you look at those numbers and consider how to do the most good, I think you'll come to the conclusion, I hope you'll come to the conclusion, that thinking about dividing up that giving from mostly domestic to a combination or more international giving is something that's worth considering. Can I have the next slide, Natasha?
Definitely. Before we move on, I have another question about this motivation and impact slide.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for going back to it.
Yeah, so for from Betsy, your question is, on the motivation and impact slide, you talked about the human impulse for nice to haves or luxuries. How do you personally balance the small circle of compassion with effective giving? And in your view, what constitutes the baseline minimum for giving as a percentage of income or something like that?
Well, if you go on the, thank you. It's a really good question, and I'm not going to have the answer. And I can talk about it at a personal level, and I can talk about it in terms of the life you can save as an organization. Let me start with the life you can save as an organization. There's on our website, when you see Take the Pledge, I think it's under Learn More on the nav bar, but you can go there and there's a calculator that would suggest, given a certain level of income, what's the minimum amount that at least we believe, based on Peter's writing and work, and that you should be giving away. So if you're looking for a guideline, and that's all it is, it's a guideline of minimums, I think there's a great spot on our website where you can get that guideline. If you're looking for something more qualitative than a number and a strategy, then let me just share my own personal view. I don't think it's best to try to question every single decision you make every day in terms of whether or not you should do this, or whether or not you should be giving the money away, and whether you should be giving the money to X, Y, or Z organization. I think that what one needs to do is look at what you've done historically and try to improve on that in two ways. One, do more research on effectiveness. You can look at our website. You can look at givewell.org. You can look at a couple of these websites that look at the real effectiveness of organizations. Don't dwell on overhead, but actually look on impact. We recommend 17 charities, 8 of which you can also find on givewell.org, as well as thelifeyoucansave.org. So I would say, number one, look back on your historical amount of research that you do. And then the next, look at what your giving has been over the last year or two or three. and then think about how can you do better. I mean, what do you and anybody else in your family, if you're consulting anybody else, want to set as a target? How much better do you want to do than you did last year? We call this personal best. And so when my wife and I decided that we were going to really make a change in how we gave, we set a budget, and we looked at what we've historically spent, and we looked at what we thought was the bare necessity to live a kind of, call it middle class, working class life. And then we actually decided to spend more than the bare necessity. And we were used to spending a lot more than that. So some people would say that's $30,000 a year per individual. Other people might say it's $60,000 a year for a family. There are obviously many, many, many families, even a majority of families, that are getting by on less than $60,000. But it depends upon what your historical spending is. So my quick answer is challenge yourself to do better. Challenge yourself to do better every year, and challenge yourself to think about the difference between a nice to have and a need to have, and bring in your friends and family into the discussion and have some useful discussions about these things. And I think what you'll find most people can do is they can make a significant reduction in what they spend. And I want to acknowledge that there are numbers of people in the United States that are living very, very close to the edge. And I'm not suggesting that everyone is in a position to donate significant amounts of money. My wife is a family doctor, and she works in a clinic with very poor people, and very few of them would have much they could easily afford to give away. On that said, if we look at donations, poorer people tend, as a percentage, to give away more annually than wealthier people. Some of that is religious-based giving, but people with less money, oddly enough, can be very, very generous. So that's my short answer to the question. And again, when we put the contact information, I'm more than happy to continue this conversation over the next days, weeks, months. It's a very important issue. And there's a number of things I've written about this under Personal Best on our blog series on our website. Okay, do you want to go back to the next, the what is effective altruism? Thank you. So there's a movement that's been growing in recent years called effective altruism. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details about all the various aspects of the movement or whether or not effective altruism is even an ideal way to think about it. I personally don't use the term effective altruism very much. I tend to use the term effective giving. But I think that if you look at the movement and what its major contribution is and will be, it starts with the question, how can I do the most good? How can I as an individual do the most good? And as one of the questions that we've already had suggested, it's not an easy question to answer. For example, how do I weigh women's rights against treatment for diarrhea or micronutrients or insecticides treated bed nets or the rights of minorities in the United States or elsewhere in the world? I mean, how do you weigh how to do the most good? And there is no single answer. But again, I think what effective altruists are suggesting and what I'm suggesting here is let's ask the question and let's challenge ourselves to really come up with good answers, to do research, to talk to our friends and family about it, and to allow people to challenge us and to read things that challenge our assumptions about what the way to do the most good. I mentioned a couple of medical research things because I do want to suggest how challenging it is to know what the right thing to do is. And I mentioned my wife is a family doctor. I also worked as a psychologist in medical settings for a long time. And I wanted to highlight two areas of research where there was a gospel. And everyone said, this is absolutely the right thing to do. And it turned out to be wrong. there are a class of medications called beta blockers, and I won't really get into what they do, but think of them as basically slowing down and making your heartbeat less strong so as to put less stress on it, which lowers blood pressure and does a lot of other things. Well, when my wife was in medical school, it was believed that if somebody had congestive heart failure, which means their heart is not beating strongly enough, that you could never give them a beta blocker, that it would be a really damaging thing to do to give that patient a beta blocker. Well, now beta blockers are used as the first line treatment for congestive heart failure. So there's brilliant doctors, brilliant researchers at all the best medical schools having to change their mind. When I was teaching in a family practice residency program, it was gospel that women who were going through menopause and after menopause should receive estrogen replacement therapy. There was some indication that it reduced the risk of cancer, but it was believed overwhelmingly that it reduced the risk of heart disease in women. It is now thought by researchers that actually estrogen replacement therapy likely increases the risk of certain forms of cancers and also likely increases the risk of heart disease. I don't mention this to discourage people from either going to the doctor, trusting your doctor, although I would suggest maybe people have too much trust sometimes, but I am, or not trusting charity recommenders like the Life You Can Save. But what I'm suggesting is we can't always know what the right thing to do is, but we must take our best guess. The physicians that advocated not using beta blockers or advocated estrogen replacement therapy had to take their best guess with the patients that they had based on the research. And I believe that the research now and common sense is telling us that we can get the most bang for our buck moving into the cost effectiveness area. We can get the most bang for our buck by donating in the developing world, where most of the people living in extreme poverty, that is living under $1.90 or $2.03, depending upon which World Bank statistic you want to use, but people living under $2 a day, in what $2 in the US would buy every day, not what $2 from the US buys in the developing world, but actually what $2 would buy in the US, that the best interventions where you can get most bang for your buck are in the developing world. Now, that said, not all non-governmental organizations in the developing world are of equal value, and some interventions are not good and other interventions are good. And fortunately, there's a growing body of evidence to help us make these decisions, which is one of the things the Life You Can Save is trying to do for people who are interested in giving. And we're trying to make more and more evidence-based decisions, even though we recognize that we can't always know what's best. Back to the question, are women's rights more important than insecticide-treated bed nets? Two very well-meaning people are going to answer that question differently. But it's really hard to argue that giving money to buy and train guide dogs for the blind in the United States, for example, is the most effective intervention, when it might cost as much as $40,000 for a guide dog to take care of a blind person in the United States for 7 years, approximately. But for $50 to $150, you can cure blindness, mostly cataracts, but other forms of blindness in the developing world. So $40,000 to cure one person of blindness, which is, of course, what all of us would want if we were blind, versus $50 to $150 if you give to SEVA or the Fred Hollows Foundation, you can cure blindness in the developing world. So there is a growing body of evidence to suggest that we can make amazingly cost-effective, impactful decisions by giving in the developing world, even though we may not have the final answer to the relative value of advocacy versus health interventions, or the relative value of women's rights or civil rights, etc. So what we're hoping in the effective altruist movement, or however what you want to call it, is that people will just not only give with their heart and their sense of compassion, but that will also use their head, their intellect, and combine the two, and will be driven to give the most impactful ways possible, and therefore get the most bang for their philanthropic dollar. Can I have the next slide, Natasha? We talked about research, and I wanted to highlight another type of research, which are called randomized controlled trials. And I think most people on the call are pretty much familiar with them. We're familiar with them from medicine, where there's a drug and we randomly assign people to getting the drug versus a placebo. And then we see which group does better and how much better. That's a simplified sense of what a randomized controlled trial is. Well, we do those overseas and in other places with interventions that charities make. And one place that's been looked at are microloans, which have received a tremendous amount of positive press, including a Nobel Prize, versus money transfers, which are direct cash transfers to people living on very little money. In many cases, Give Directly, which is the charity that we recommend that does these money transfers, give people $1,000 to people living often on less than 65 cents a day. And Natasha, can you give me the next slide? And what the evidence finds, contrary to what I would have believed and what probably many people on this call would have believed, is that unrestricted cash transfers beats microloans as effective intervention. And when I first heard about Give Directly giving $1,000 to people in the developing world, to families, I was thinking that just can't be right. What if they misspend the money? You know, I had a typical distrust of letting people make their own decisions. I had the typical sort of paternalistic view. But in fact, what we find is that we have very, very high degrees of effectiveness of these unrestricted cash transfers. And over time, people are earning more money, as you can see. Their asset goes up and their hunger decreases. Interestingly enough, one of the main interventions that is used with the cash transfers are people put on a metal roof on their otherwise thatched roof house. And maybe that seems like a small thing, but if you actually think of having a roof over your head where you're not only you and your family aren't the only ones living there, but all of your food is stored there. You can imagine when it gets wet, it gets moldy, and you already have you're already challenged to have enough food. And now when it gets moldy and wet, it's no good to eat anymore. By putting a metal roof on your house for $300, you can actually ensure that food will stay edible. And that is one of the very interesting things that we see people do with this money. And surprisingly little of it goes for things like beer or cigarettes, or the kinds of things that the more cynical part of ourselves might actually expect that people might be using the money for. Again, evidence. And the good news is there are organizations like the Life You Can Save that are looking at this evidence and distilling it for people who don't want to have to wade through mountains of evidence. For people who really want lots and lots of detail and lots of primary research, then there's an organization called GiveWell.org, and we borrow they recommend 8 charities, of which we recommend all of their 8 charities, but they have a lot of granular information on their website. So people don't have to go out, if they're trusting of our organizations, they don't have to go out and do all this research themselves. There are organizations that are doing this research for them and making recommendations. Can you go to the next slide, Natasha? So let's just share a little bit about the Life You Can Save. The Life You Can Save, as I said, after we provided it with seed money back in 2013, has developed a nice growth curve off a very small base. So you can see the numbers here, but basically last year we spent about 1/5, actually less. We moved about $1,350,000 on less than a $300,000 spend, which means that we sent more money through our website to highly effective charities than we spent by a factor of 5, a little over 5 actually, and that's the most conservative estimate. So I'm really excited about what the Life You Can Save can do. I'm interested in growing it into a mass marketing organization that begins to reach more and more people, not necessarily people like the people on this call that are already interested in philanthropy, although I'd love to be able to talk to people like yourselves more and share our different thoughts with each other. But we also want to reach people who represent that macro data of very little research, only 9% compare organizations. We want to take the concept of effective giving and bring it across Western Europe, the United States, and Australia and Canada. And we want to get people to think about this concept of, should charity really begin at home? We never, or we rarely, I should say, raise money for the Life You Can Save itself. I do that through individual conversations with donors because it's really hard to say, oh, the Life You Can Save is recommending these great charities. Oh, by the way, give money to the Life You Can Save. It requires a lot of discussion as to why the Life You Can Save can use donations itself and why that leverages people's donations. So we've pretty much to date kept fundraising for the Life You Can Save off to the side, and that's been one of my primary responsibilities as executive director. Can we have the last slide, Natasha, before we go to questions? So, takeaway tips. Obviously, use data to inform your decisions. I would suggest you don't necessarily have to do all the research yourself. Use organizations like the Life You Can Save and GiveWell.org to inform your decisions. Try to raise the questions that you look into with your greater community and spread the idea of thinking about impact and effectiveness to more and more people as you can. Expand your circle of compassion. Back to that question about how to decide how much to spend in that lower left part of the XY axis, or how much to move up towards the most effective forms of giving. But if you can do your personal best, do more research and give more money, I think what most of us who do that find is that we lead more satisfying lives. We're happier and we feel better about ourselves, and we seem to be able to survive without some of the discretionary things or luxury things that we felt we needed. And what people need is very contextual, and I think, again, bears a lot of discussion in your families, in your relationships, and in your community. And not everyone's going to make the same decisions. There are people who are extreme and who give away most of their income and live on very little. And then there are others who give away almost nothing. And in my work with the Life You Can Save, I've run into both types of people. And I aspire to being more like the former, although I don't aspire to giving everything away. I aspire to trying to become a better, more effective giver, a more generous giver, in the same way that I aspire to be a better spouse, a better father, and a better friend. And I'm a strong believer, I guess partly as the social psychology professor that I was, I'm a strong believer in personal best and not beating yourself up for mistakes of the past or things you could have done differently, but choosing to do better in the future. And I think that creates more energy in ourselves and in the people we touch than being driven by guilt. And then only the guilt drives us into what sometimes is referred to as defensive avoidance. And so we just don't think about it at all. And the next thing we know is we're driving away from effectiveness in our luxury car. So let me stop there. And again, thank you, Natasha, and to your group at LAAF for making this possibility. And let me see what questions there are. And then I'd like to make sure that we somehow put up the contact information so people can see that. Okay, Natasha?
Great. Thank you so much for that overview, Charlie. Are you able to see the questions on the screen, or would you like for me to read the
I don't
questions?
see anything except the LAAF logo flashing in green. And in the lower right, I see a picture of myself, which I'd rather not see.
All right, so we have a few audience questions that I can ask. So the first kind of concerns the example that you gave about blindness. So the question reads, given that there are interventions that are clearly more impactful than others, for example, curing blindness in the developing world versus training guide dogs, if the goal is for everyone to give more impactfully, what happens to those of us who need guide dogs?
The same thing that happens to people who don't get cataract surgery currently in the developing world, or people who are dying of diarrhea that could easily be treated with just some rehydration therapy, which is that they suffer. And then they suffer needlessly, because I believe that if we give effectively and if people give generously, we have room to do both things. We don't necessarily have room to do everything in health. I think some of the decisions, without getting into a lot of philosophical debate, that are made in healthcare are just overly expensive given the world's resources. But the question is prioritization. So if I am blind and I don't get a guide dog and I can't afford it, I suffer. And there are a lot of people in the United States, my wife's patients among them, who are suffering because they can't get something like a guide dog, or they can't afford their diabetes medication, or lots of things like that. But I think we have to look at the relative suffering. And so the answer to the question, the short answer is, if somebody doesn't get a guide dog, they suffer. They really suffer. The difference is the tens of thousands of people that are going blind who don't need to go blind, who are suffering even more and who could be saved.
Great, thank you. Another question from our audience is about how the movement or effective altruism is really concerned with kind of quantifying and ultimately alleviating the amount of suffering in the world. How do effective altruists and the life you can save compare animal suffering and human suffering?
Well, that's also a really good question, as are all the questions so far, anyway. I can't. I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not an ethicist. I can't compare animal suffering to human suffering, and I will confess, at the risk of Peter hitting me over the head, that I tend to be a bit of a speciesist. I don't know if that's the right word. But I tend to be more concerned about children suffering who are human than animal suffering, but I am concerned about animal suffering. And 84% of the animal suffering in the world, as I understand it, comes from chickens who are kept in horrendous conditions. So what I've tried to do myself to make sure that I'm addressing animal suffering is refuse to eat chicken that is in any way, shape, or form not the kind of chickens that are raised, for example, on my son's farm, where they're running around. You know, they have more free time than my son does, who's a farmer. So I don't think that's the answer. There are many, many philosophers, including Peter Singer, who could give far better answers. But I think that we ought to be very concerned about animal suffering. I think a lot of animal suffering could be significantly reduced if we just attacked the suffering that comes from raising chickens inhumanely. But there's a remaining 16% that we could deal with. But I think that the human suffering that's occurring, that's also easily preventable, should be looked at concurrently. And I think all of us, at least probably all of us on this phone call, can take really big strides to alleviate human suffering by our generosity, as well as in our own personal behavior and time to alleviate animal suffering. And I'm not a vegan, but I should be from a purely ethical point of view. And so, again, using the concept of personal best, I think we should make more and more strides to reduce human suffering and animal suffering every year at the same time. And one doesn't have to await the other one. So that's my rather ineffective answer to that question.
Thank you. So another question from our audience. People who may not have the income to donate a lot of money can still be philanthropic through giving their time, their effort, or their network to a nonprofit. When you're focused on working in extreme poverty, it can be harder for people to be philanthropic in a non-monetary way. So a two-pronged question here. One is, have you taken this into consideration when choosing which nonprofits to sponsor? And two, do you think there's a way for people to get involved non-monetarily with the nonprofits that the Life You Can Save sponsors that doesn't involve being on the ground in developing nations?
So the answer to the second part of the question is very easy, and the answer is yes. I think there are several organizations that could use people who are dedicated and smart and have some skills, and they don't have to be extraordinary skills, and as volunteers. And I mean, almost all the organizations could. And the Life You Can Save uses a lot of volunteers and will continue to use volunteers, particularly as they have specific skills that are areas that we have deficits in. As far as thinking about choosing organizations for on that basis, as far as I know, and I'm not involved in the charity selection part, we don't consider the ability for an organization to absorb volunteers. I think we would make the assumption that virtually all of them can, but I've never heard it discussed as a primary concern in choosing the organizations. I do want to add that I think people who make very little money, depending upon how we define it, can be quite generous. They can give away $50, $100 and feel really good about it. For example, you can buy an insecticide-treated bed net for $2.50 that covers, excuse me, 2 individuals for 1.8 to 3 years, depending upon how it's used. That's got to feel really good, I would think. Similarly, as I suggested, you can provide a cataract surgery to cure somebody of blindness for between $50 and $150. So I would suggest that, that anybody who's knowledgeable or can access the information or wants to get the information could find that for very little money, they could help a lot, and they could also volunteer. So I think it's a really good situation for people that don't have any disposable income or very much disposable income.
Great, thank you. And now maybe just to finish off, one more question kind of aimed at aimed at everyone is how can people who are listening in and might be interested in continuing to learn about effective altruism, what resources or organizations or books would you point people to as they continue to learn?
So I think that, at the risk of sounding self-serving, our website has an enormous amount of content that's relative to extreme poverty. And I think it's a really good resource if you want to spend the time exploring it. There's tens and maybe hundreds of hours worth of content, both videos and written content. If one is looking for very granular presentation, very detailed presentation of why 8 specific charities are highly effective, then I suggest givewell.org. I suggest that Peter's book, The Life You Can Save, is a really good introduction to the fight against extreme poverty and some of the arguments about ways to fight it and our ethical obligation to fight it. And then a broader book that he wrote called The Most Good You Can Do is a more recent book, I think came out last year, is just generally about effective altruism, not just about the fight against extreme poverty. And then a highly quantitative book that's very, very good, written by a disciple of Peter Singer's, who's a professor at Oxford, named Will MacAskill, which is entitled Doing Good Better, is also a really, really good book. It's a bit more complex than The Life You Can Save, and is a tougher read, but is a good reference book, and it's not the thing you're going to sit down with for 2 hours and read straight through, but it is a really, really good book. So that's Doing Good Better by Will MacAskill. And then I love the idea of people trying to get in touch with me or getting in touch with me, and I can refer them to lots of people in the movement and even outside the movement who are interested in what you're interested in. If you write to me and explain to me what you're interested in learning more about. Natasha, does that cover it?
Yeah, great. That's a really helpful overview for everyone. We're just about time.
Can we put the contact information somewhere where people can see it?
Yeah, so I can post that information, but do you just want to if you want to give people your email, now could be a good time, or the best email to contact you.
All right, so the email is Charlie, CHARLIE .Bressler, B like in boy, RESLER, at thelifeyoucansave.org. So The Life You Can Save is just one word, thelifeyoucansave.org. And if you send me an email, I promise to respond. Introduce yourself and tell me what you're interested in, and I'll look forward to communicating further.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Charlie, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in today to learn some more. If you want to learn more, you can reach out to Charlie. You can reach out to me at Natasha at laaf.org, or visit the resources on our website. And thank you so much for your time. And if you also have any other suggestions about the type of content you'd like to see, or things you'd like to learn about, that's something that you can contact me about directly. So thank you very much for tuning in.
Thanks very much, Natasha.
Okay, thank you, Charlie.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.